First story, room 34. Working the night shift wasn't exactly what I envisioned when I applied to be a nurse. But honestly, I couldn't pass up the opportunity. St. Mary's Psychiatric Hospital was one of the oldest facilities in the state, and the pay was good. People whispered about the hospital's history, stories of strange occurrences and an abandoned wing that had been sealed off for years. But I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. The first few weeks went by without anything out of the ordinary. It was a job like any other. Administer meds, check vitals, make sure the patients were comfortable. But there was always a strange feeling in the air, an underlying sense of something left unfinished. The West Wing, the one they closed down, was always dark and quiet, its corridors stretching into shadow. No one ever talked about it, at least not openly. There were hushed conversations in the break room, nurses making jokes that weren't really jokes at all. They glanced toward the door as if expecting someone or something to be listening. That's when I first heard about room 34. One night, I was asked to cover for an overnight shift. I had worked the late shift before, but never all the way through until morning. As I went through the usual rounds, something caught my eye in the system. Room 34 had vitals logged in. Heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate. All the stats were there as if a patient had been monitored. But that was impossible. That room was in the closed-off section. It hadn't been used in decades. Curiosity got the best of me. Maybe it was just a glitch in the system, I thought. Or maybe someone was playing a prank on the new girl. I tried to shake it off, but my eyes kept drifting back to that room number on the screen. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the West Wing. The air grew colder as I walked down the dimly lit halls. My footsteps echoed off the tile floors, and with each step, a sense of dread built up in my chest. I told myself it was just an old building, that the chill was because of poor insulation. Still, my hands trembled as I reached the end of the corridor. There it was, room 34. The door looked like any other door, but something about it felt wrong. My heart raced as I turned the handle, expecting it to be locked. But it wasn't. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. I stepped into the room, shining my flashlight across the walls. At first, it seemed like any other unused space, dusty and forgotten. But then the beam of light landed on something that made my blood run cold. There, on the walls, was my name, Laura Thompson, written over and over again, scrawled in a frantic, messy script. But that wasn't all. Below my name were details about me. My birth date, my address, personal information I had never shared with anyone at the hospital. I felt dizzy, my vision blurring as panic set in. My breathing quickened, and suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped even more. That's when I heard it, a whisper. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible. But then it grew louder, more insistent. Laura, my name, being whispered over and over from every corner of the room. I spun around, my flashlight flickering. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the whispers grew more chaotic, overlapping with one another until they filled the room like a chorus of voices. I backed toward the door, my hand fumbling for the handle. I needed to get out, but no matter how hard I turned it, the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. I slammed my fists against it, shouting for help, but the whispers only grew louder, drowning out my voice. The lights overhead flickered violently. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move in the corner of the room. A figure, standing there, watching me. The whispers became more urgent, repeating my name in a tone that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, the lights went out completely. I was enveloped in darkness. The whispers stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears, my breath shallow and quick. Then, out of the darkness, a voice, clear and distinct, cut through the silence. "You shouldn't have come." I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as fear overtook me. I felt something cold brush against the back of my neck, and I let out a scream, pounding against the door with everything I had. And then, nothing. I woke up to daylight streaming in through the small window, the room bathed in the soft glow of morning. But I wasn't in room 34 anymore. I was lying on the floor outside it, the door sealed shut once again. I scrambled to my feet, disoriented, my heart still racing. I rushed back to the nurse's station, frantic, trying to explain what had happened. But when I checked the records, room 34 no longer had any vitals logged. It was as if nothing had ever happened. My co-workers gave me strange looks as I babbled about the room and the whispers, but they dismissed it as stress from the night shift. Later that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. I decided to check the old patient records for room 34, desperate for an explanation. What I found sent a chill through me. A patient, admitted decades ago, had once stayed in room 34. His name? George Thompson. My father's name. A man who had disappeared when I was just a child. The note said he suffered from hallucinations, claiming the walls of his room whispered to him, calling his name. His file ended abruptly with a single note: discharged under unknown circumstances. Patient missing. I went back to room 34 that night, determined to understand. But when I arrived, the door was locked, as it had been for years. I banged on it, calling out for answers, but the only response was the soft hum of the hospital's electrical system. The next morning, the staff found the door to room 34 wide open, but I was gone. All that remained were my personal details, written in the old patient logs next to the name of George Thompson. To them, I had vanished, just another patient who never existed. But I'm still here, trapped in room 34, waiting for the next name to appear on the wall. Second story, The Song of the Mad. I had always believed music could heal. That was why I became a music therapist in the first place. But when I was asked to work at Blackridge Asylum, a place known for housing some of the most disturbed minds, I was hesitant. There were rumors about the place. Dark, twisted rumors that I dismissed as mere gossip. Still, there was a part of me deep down that wondered if there might be some truth to the stories. My first day was uneventful. Blackridge was as grim as I'd expected. Long, cold hallways with peeling paint, the smell of bleach barely masking something far more unsettling. The patients were a mixture of those lost in their own worlds and others who seemed far too aware of things most of us would rather ignore. It was during my second week that I first heard the song. It was late, around 10 p.m. I had stayed behind to finish some paperwork when I heard it. Soft at first, just a hum, barely distinguishable from the hum of the fluorescent lights. But as I walked through the halls, it grew louder, a haunting melody that seemed to seep out from the walls themselves. Following the sound, I found myself standing outside the patient's communal room. I opened the door slightly, just enough to peek in. Inside, several patients, ones who usually sat in silence, lost in their madness, were singing. The tune was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was eerie, the kind of song that sent chills down your spine without you quite understanding why. But what struck me most was that they were perfectly in sync. These were patients who barely spoke a word most days, but now they sang together as if rehearsed. I approached Dr. Grayson, the head of the facility, the next day. "They were singing last night," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. All of them in perfect harmony. It was unsettling. He gave me a tight-lipped smile. "Yes, they do that from time to time. We don't know why. The song never seems to change, and none of them have any musical training. It's one of Blackridge's mysteries." Mysteries? That didn't sit well with me. Music, I thought, was something I understood. I could figure this out. But when I asked more questions, I got vague answers or nervous shrugs. The staff was uneasy about the song, and they refused to discuss it at length. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I stayed late again, waiting for the song to begin. Sure enough, around the same time, the haunting melody drifted through the halls. This time, I brought a small recorder with me. I stood outside the communal room, listening as the patients sang in perfect unison, and hit the record button. But when I played it back later, all I heard was static. No song.
No voices.
Just an awful, grating sound like nails on a chalkboard. The next night, I tried again using a different device. Same result. Static. It was impossible. How could something that clear to my ears not be captured on tape? My obsession grew. The song started to consume my thoughts. I couldn't shake the melody from my head. Played over and over, even when the patients weren't singing. Couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the tune was there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. One evening, after another failed attempt to record the song, I made a decision. If I couldn't capture it on tape, maybe I could play it myself. I had spent enough nights listening to it. The notes were etched into my memory. I sat down at the old piano in the therapy room. My fingers trembled as they hovered over the keys. Slowly, I began to play, hesitating at first, then letting the melody flow through me. It was as if my hands moved on their own, guided by something deep and dark. As soon as I hit the final note, something shifted. The patient's singing stopped abruptly. I could hear footsteps approaching, and before I knew it, they were standing at the doorway, silent, staring. Their eyes, normally vacant, now glinted with something unsettling. And then, in unison, they spoke. "You can't hide from it, Sophia." I froze. How did they know my name? I had never interacted with most of them before, but it got worse. They began to speak about my life, details they couldn't possibly know. My father's death when I was 9, the time I had broken my arm and hidden it from my mother to avoid trouble, even the secrets I had told no one. Their voices merged into one, speaking in a low, chilling tone, revealing every part of me that I had kept hidden. Panic surged through me, and I slammed the piano shut. The patients immediately fell silent, their heads tilting slightly as if listening for something I couldn't hear. I backed away from the piano, but the melody continued to echo in my mind. I couldn't stop hearing it, no matter how much I tried. It was there, always there, haunting me. I left the room, my breath shallow, my pulse racing. But the song followed me. It was no longer confined to the patients' voices or the piano. It was in my head, looping endlessly. I could hear it in every creak of the building, in the hum of the lights, in my own heartbeat. I tried to sleep that night, but the song filled my dreams, warping them into nightmares I couldn't escape. As the days passed, I started losing time. I would find myself standing in strange places, outside the patients' rooms, by the piano, even near the West Wing, which had been closed off for years, without remembering how I got there. The staff began to look at me with concern. Whispers followed me wherever I went, but they weren't coming from the patients anymore. They were coming from inside my head. I tried to leave Blackridge, but every time I reached the exit, something pulled me back. It was as if the asylum wouldn't let me go. One morning, after yet another sleepless night, I woke up in a room I didn't recognize. The walls were padded, the door locked from the outside. And then it hit me, I was no longer the therapist. I was the patient. Now every night I hear the song. It flows from me like it once did from the patients, haunting and relentless. I sing just as they did, unable to stop. And the new therapists, the ones who arrive bright-eyed and hopeful, they hear it too. They'll try to understand, just as I did. But they won't, not until it's too late. Third story. I never believed in curses or premonitions or anything of the sort. As a psychiatrist, I deal in the tangible, the concrete. The mind, with all its complexities, is something that can be studied, categorized, understood. So when I took the temporary assignment at Ridgeview Asylum, I didn't think twice. It was a simple job. Assess the remaining patients as the facility was being shut down and determine who could be safely transferred or released. Easy. Routine even, or so I thought. Ridgeview had a reputation, the kind that made the locals wary. The asylum had been operational for over 70 years, housing patients deemed too dangerous, too unstable, or simply too unwanted by society. By the time I arrived, it was a shadow of its former self. Only a handful of patients remained, the halls mostly empty, echoing with decades of forgotten pain. One name kept coming up during my interviews: Patient 217. No one seemed to know much about him. The orderlies spoke in hushed tones, avoiding direct answers, and even the senior staff dismissed my questions with vague responses. But the patients were terrified. "Have you seen him?" one woman asked me, her eyes wide with fear as I conducted her assessment. "You'll know him when you do. You'll feel him. His touch is wrong." Another patient, a man who had been in the asylum for over 30 years, gripped my wrist with surprising strength. "Don't go near him," he whispered, his voice trembling. "He knows. He always knows." I couldn't shake the curiosity. Who was this man? And why was everyone so afraid of him? I decided to dig into the records, something I probably shouldn't have done alone. The asylum's filing system was archaic, dusty folders and handwritten notes crammed into metal cabinets that hadn't been touched in years. I found patient 217's file tucked between two others, nearly forgotten. His name was Michael Thorne, admitted in 1975 for what the initial psychiatrist described as delusional premonitions. Thorne had been a regular man until one day, seemingly out of nowhere, he began claiming that he could sense when someone was going to die. According to the notes, his ability wasn't based on intuition or educated guesses. No, he insisted that a single touch, a handshake, a brush of the shoulder, was all it took. After that, the countdown would begin. I flipped through the pages, the psychiatrist's notes becoming increasingly erratic. Several staff members who had interacted with Thorne reported feeling unsettled after touching him. A nurse resigned abruptly after a session with him, claiming she felt her life slipping away. 3 weeks later, she was found dead from an aneurysm. The most disturbing part? Every death that occurred in Ridgeview, staff or patient, was tied to physical contact with patient 217. The cause of death varied, but the timing always matched Thorne's warnings. The records stopped abruptly in 1981. No mention of transfers, no note of his release or death. Just nothing. I was left with more questions than answers, so I sought out the head of records the next day to inquire further. But when I returned to the filing room, the folder was gone. Not misplaced, gone. Every trace of Michael Thorne had vanished from the archives. That night, I had the first nightmare. It was vivid, more real than anything I'd ever experienced. I stood in one of Ridgeview's long, dimly lit hallways, the air thick with an oppressive silence. In the distance, a figure stood, a man. His back was to me at first, but I knew who it was. Patient 217. He turned slowly, his face gaunt, eyes hollow. He looked at me like he'd been waiting for years. "You'll be next," he whispered. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding. I tried to dismiss it as just my mind playing tricks, a response to the unsettling records I had read. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, and things only got worse from there. In the days that followed, strange things started happening. A nurse I had spoken to earlier in the week collapsed suddenly and died in the break room. They said it was a heart attack, but she had been perfectly healthy. Then, one of the orderlies I'd bumped into in the hallway went missing. He was found days later in a nearby river, drowned, though no one could explain how he ended up there. Every incident seemed to happen after a moment of contact with me. A handshake, a pat on the shoulder, and each death felt like a ticking clock, counting down to something I couldn't fully understand. By then, my nightmares had become a nightly occurrence. Every time, patient 217 was there, watching me, repeating the same words in that flat, emotionless tone. "You'll be next." I tried to rationalize it. I tried to tell myself it was all just stress. But deep down, I knew Michael Thorne's curse had passed to me. And now, every touch I made, Every person I interacted with was at risk. I decided to leave Ridgeview. I couldn't stay. Whatever was happening, whether it was psychological or something far worse, I needed to get out. But as I packed my things, something stopped me. The hallway outside my office seemed to stretch impossibly long, the lights flickering. And at the end of that hallway, standing motionless in the shadows, was him. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. I had to get out. Now, I rushed down to the front entrance, the walls of Ridgeview closing in on me, the air thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. But when I reached the exit, 2 orderlies were there. They looked at me with an unnerving calm, almost as if they'd been expecting me. "I need to leave," I stammered. "I'm not." But before I could finish, one of them reached for me, his grip firm. "It's time to go back to your room, patient 217. "What? No, I'm not." My words caught in my throat as I realized they weren't listening. They were escorting me, guiding me through the halls as if I belonged there, as if I had always belonged there. I tried to fight, to explain, but it was no use. Every door we passed seemed to slam shut behind me. Every window was barred, every exit blocked. I felt the walls closing in, tighter and tighter, until we arrived at a room at the far end of the asylum. The door swung open, revealing a single bed, stark white sheets, and a small window that overlooked the grounds. "This is your room now," the orderly said softly, almost kindly. I screamed, fought, begged them to listen, but it was no use. They left me there, locking the door behind them. And as I collapsed onto the bed, exhausted and terrified, I saw him again, Michael Thorne, standing just beyond the window, watching me from the shadows. "I am patient 217 now, and no one will ever believe me." Fourth story. I had been working as a janitor at Ashwood Asylum for a little over 2 years when they finally asked me to clean the upper floors. No one ever talked about them, and they'd been sealed off since the 1960s, left to gather dust while the rest of the building slowly crumbled under the weight of its own history. The upper floors were where the worst cases had been kept, patients too violent or disturbed to be around anyone else. For years, it was a place no one touched. But with the asylum being sold to developers, my supervisor wanted the whole building cleaned out, top to bottom. "Just give it a good sweep," he told me. "Don't need to get fancy. Just make it presentable." I agreed, though part of me had always been curious about those floors. What had really gone on up there? The stairwell creaked as I made my way up, dust swirling in the narrow beams of light coming through the small, grimy windows. The place felt untouched, frozen in time. The moment I stepped onto the 5th floor, the air changed. It was heavier, colder, almost like stepping into a different world. The halls were long and dim, the old fluorescent lights flickering weakly above. I could feel the history in every step I took, in every echo that bounced back at me. But as unsettling as it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. I first saw him while cleaning the windows in one of the patient rooms. A tall man in a white lab coat, standing by the window at the end of the hall, looking out toward the forest beyond the asylum grounds. His posture was rigid, hands clasped behind his back, head slightly tilted as if he were lost in thought. I blinked, and when I looked again, he was gone, just like that. At first, I assumed it was just my mind playing tricks. These old buildings could do that, especially after decades of stories and rumors about what had gone on inside. But I couldn't shake the image of him, standing there, staring out into the distance. I shook it off, chalking it up to my imagination, and got back to work. But then, the next day, he was there again. Same place, same window. This time, I didn't hesitate. I dropped my mop and started walking down the hall toward him, determined to figure out who or what I had seen. As I got closer, the figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge me. I could see the back of his lab coat, crisp and clean despite the decay around us. His hair was short, neatly combed. He looked out of place, like he didn't belong in this forgotten wing. But before I could get close enough to see his face, he vanished. One moment he was there, the next gone. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart pounding in my chest. No footsteps, no sound, nothing. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing him in my mind, the man in the white coat, standing by the window. Something about him felt wrong, like he wasn't just a shadow of the past, but something more. The next day, I did what any rational person would do. I started digging. The asylum's archives were a mess, piles of patient records and staff logs stacked haphazardly in boxes. But after hours of searching, I finally found what I was looking for. His name was Dr. Richard Hale, a renowned psychiatrist who had worked at Ashwood during the 1950s. According to the records, he had been involved in some controversial treatments, experiments on the more disturbed patients that the staff had kept quiet. But what really caught my attention was how his career ended. In 1963, there was a massive outbreak of violence on the upper floors. Patients had rioted, some attacking staff, others turning on each other. Dr. Hale had been overseeing the ward that night, and he was never seen again. No body was ever found. The official report said he had been likely killed in the chaos, but no one could explain the strange circumstances around his disappearance. The patients who survived claimed that Hale had gone mad in the days leading up to the incident. Some even said he had started talking to himself, staring out that same window I'd seen him at, as if waiting for something. Over the next few days, I saw him again and again, always at the window, always staring out at the forest. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was the isolation of working in such a forgotten place. But each time, the encounters lasted a little longer. Each time, I felt more drawn to him. By the 5th day, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. Armed with nothing but my flashlight and a sense of dread I couldn't shake, I returned to the upper floor that night. The halls were darker than before, the air thick with an unnatural chill. I could hear my own footsteps echoing, but underneath that sound was something else. A faint, distant murmuring, like whispers just out of reach. When I reached the end of the hall, he was there. Dr. Hale, standing at the window, just as I had seen him before. But this time, he didn't disappear. This time, he turned. His face was pale, eyes sunken deep into his skull, and his expression was blank, devoid of emotion. But there was something familiar about him that I couldn't place, something that gnawed at the back of my mind. Slowly, I walked toward him, my footsteps sounding impossibly loud in the silence. As I reached the window, I expected him to vanish again. But instead, he stepped aside, revealing my reflection in the glass. And that's when I froze. In the dim light of the moon, I saw myself, but not as I should have been. I was wearing a white lab coat, just like his. My hands, once rough and worn from years of work, were now pristine, holding a clipboard. The name stitched into the coat's breast pocket wasn't mine. It read, Dr. Richard Hale. I stumbled back, heart racing, my breath catching in my throat. But when I turned around, the hallway was no longer empty. The patients were there, rows of them standing in silence, watching me. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollow, some with bandages wrapped around their heads, others with restraints still hanging loosely from their wrists. They didn't move, they didn't speak, they just stared. And then I realized the truth. I was never the janitor. I had never been cleaning these halls. I had been here all along, trapped in this forgotten wing. Dr. Hale's madness wasn't something I had discovered. It was something I had inherited. I turned back to the window, but the reflection didn't change. The man staring back at me, wearing that pristine white coat, was me. And I knew, in that moment, I would never leave the upper floors of Ashwood Asylum again.